Today's lesson is 3-3, proving lines are parallel. Now in order to do that, we kind of have to understand what we were doing before. So here's an example from before. We've had this in our 3-2 notes, and it says, alternate exterior angles theorem. If two lines are parallel and cut by a transversal, then alternate exterior angles are congruent. This says if this, then this. So if they're parallel, then they're congruent. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be going backwards. So we're going to say if they're congruent, then the lines are parallel. It isn't any much different than what we've been doing, but we just understand the concept of why we are doing it. So the first one says, what kind of angles are angles 1 and 5? And we can see that it says if the angles 1 and 5 are corresponding, because they kind of fall into that same box to where they're both on the top left, sorry. So it says if two lines in a plane are cut by transversal so that corresponding angles are, as we know, they're congruent, then the lines are parallel. So you can see it's kind of backwards. When before, if we look up here, it says if they're parallel, and here it says if they're cut to make them congruent, then they're parallel. It's just kind of wording it backwards. We'll see where it comes different when it comes down to the homework. So for now, let's just copy down the notes. So if two planes are cut by transversal so that corresponding angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. Moving on. 1 and 8 make alternate exterior angles. If two lines in a plane are cut by transversal so that alternate exterior angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. Feel free to pause the video as needed to make sure you have it all copied down. 3 and 6. Alternate interior. If two lines in a plane are cut by a transversal so that alternate interior angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. And lastly, 3 and 5. Then the same side on the inside, so say consecutive interior angles. If two lines in a plane are cut by transversal, so that consecutive interior angles are, this is the one that's different. These two add up to 180. Therefore, they are supplementary. Then the lines are parallel. So let's look at the examples. Use the figure to the right to answer the examples. In example 1, if the measure of angle 2 equals 5x minus 2, and the measure of angle 6 equals 4x plus 11, find x so that line A is parallel to line B. So our goal is to make that true, make those two lines parallel. So 2 is here, 6 is here. We know that those two are called corresponding angles. Let's make that a little bigger. And we know that corresponding angles, if the lines are parallel, must be congruent. And under that, I want you to write that congruent means the same, equal. So the corresponding angles must be congruent, which means the same and equal. Let's make it a darker color. Now, so we're going to put them equal to each other to find out what the x value must be in order to make it congruent. So I'm going to do the work off to the side so you can see it clearly. We get 5x minus 2 must equal 4x plus 11. Remember, when we subtract something like 4x, you have to do the opposite, subtracting. Those two cancel, I get x minus 2 equals 11. To move this 2, I want to add it because it's a negative. So x equals 13. Therefore, x must equal 13 in order to make those lines parallel. Pause the video to copy it down, as I'm going to shrink it and kind of get started with example 2. So now example 2 is dealing with angle 4 and angle 6, and we want to make the lines parallel again. 4 and 6, those two angles are consecutive interior angles, and we know that consecutive interior angles, if the lines are parallel, must be supplementary, which means adds to equal 180. So let's go ahead and solve this one off to the side. Therefore I get x plus 50 plus 3x minus 30 equals 180. They are on the same side, so I'm just going to combine them. That gives me 4x. 50 and negative 30 gives me plus 20 equals 180. Subtract the 20. 4x equals 160. Divide by 4. X equals 40. So it must be x must equal 40 in order for the lines to be parallel, as the question is stating. Please make sure you pause the video and copy it down so we can move on to example 3. In example 3, we're dealing with angles 2 and 7. What are those two called? If you said alternate exterior angles, you are correct. Don't forget, alternate exterior angles must be congruent, which means the same, so we put them equal to each other. So let's go ahead and solve this problem off to the side. I'll set it up and I want you to solve it on your own. We get 10x minus 8 must be equal to 5x plus 27. Go ahead and solve and see if you can get what the answer for x is. You should have gotten x equals 7. If you did not get that, please check your work and fix it on your paper. Now let's go to example 4. In example 4, we are dealing with angles 4 and 5, which we know are alternate interior angles. We know that alternate interior angles must be congruent, which means the same slash equal to each other. So let's go ahead and solve this problem. I want you to try this one on your own to see if you can get it from the start. If done correctly, you should have gotten x equals 2. Please check your work if you did not, and copy down what is needed to make sure you have it correct on your notes. So now I want to go over a couple problems from the homework. Because the homework, certain sections look slightly different than what the notes said. So these questions here are very important because you'll most likely see these type of questions on the test as well. That may be something you want to put a star next to, write it on your notebook, but they're good test questions to have. It says use the picture to the right, fill in the blank with the angle pair name, then state the lines that you can conclude are parallel. That's the part that's new. So for example, angles 4 and 15. When you find your two angles, I want you to highlight every line that's touching one or two of those angles. For example, angle A is touching angle 4, angle B is touching angle 15, and line D is touching angles 4 and 15. So out of those three that are highlighted in blue, we need to determine which two are parallel. So out of these three, we can see that A and B are going to be my two parallel lines. So number 1 says 4 and 15 are. Those are alternate exterior angles. Conclusion: A is parallel to B. Don't forget, this right here means is parallel. So A is parallel to B. That's what we have to do for all these problems in the front. Determine the name and which lines are parallel based off of those. So the last one for this section that I want to go over, let me clear this off, is number 6. So number 6 says 13 and 10 are. We see 13 and 10 are right here. If you remember from the last unit, which is going to be important since you have the retest again, 13 and 10 are vertical angles. So let's go ahead and write that in. Conclusion. I'm going to highlight again everything that's touching those two. C is touching 13 and 10. And that was wrong. C is touching 13 and 10. B is touching 13 and 10. And that's it. As you can see, C isn't parallel to B. And since there's no other line being used, we can't conclude that any lines are parallel. So on the bottom, we're just going to write our conclusion. No conclusion. Because we can't prove that any lines are parallel. If you have any questions on what I mean by this, just raise your hand and ask me. And I'm going to go over questions 7 and 8 from this piece here. The directions are the same. Use a diagram at the right. Given the following information, determine which lines, if any is the key word, are parallel. So the first one, given that 7 and 6 equal 180. So 7 is here, 6 is here. We can see that those are going to be consecutive interior. So the lines that are touching are J, P, and Q. Now out of those three, which two are parallel? P is parallel to Q. Now let's clear this all and try number 8. Instead of 8, I'm going to go ahead and do 12. 12 says angles 1 and 2 equal 180. Now I'm going to assume that's going to be consecutive interior again, but I may be wrong. Because if 1 is here and 2 is here, angle 1 isn't on the inside. Or it is, but angle 2 isn't on the same inside. There's a line in between them. So let's see which ones it touches. If I look closely, these two here form a linear pair. Two angles that add up to 180. That's a linear pair. So the two lines that are touching it, P, G, and there's no other. Since it's only those two, because angle 2 is touching this one here, not the one under it, I can't assume that these two are the same, or that these two are parallel. So it says, if any are parallel, you're going to write none. Hopefully it didn't confuse anybody. This bottom section is just like the notes. You're figuring out what the name of it is. So I want the name. I want the rule. And then I want you to solve for x, just like we've been doing before.